Blessed starts off his video. Blessed starts off his video defining what makes a work anonymous. He says that if it's anonymous, it means that the authorship is not included in the preface title and sometimes not in the body of work. Okay.
There's views like Gathercole and others, who we'll mention later, who hold anonymity should not be defined in this manner. For many ancient works circulated without authorship, not including the preface nor title, and other times not by religious folks who want to authenticate.
Alright, so he says the titles are found in the Gospels as... Oh, this is old positions. Although I do believe he agrees that the titles are found... or the titles are added later. Okay, so he writes here, these are old positions on gospel authorship. So these might be some thoughts on why the titles were added later, even if there were original titles. Scholars in general would probably not think that those were the authors who wrote the Gospels. Just the fact that the titles not being there is not in and of itself why authors don't think some of the authors, or why scholars don't think some of the authors were who wrote it. Your number 2 says, since the Gospels do not have a title like other New Testament writings, it shows that we don't know who the original authors were. For example, Paul names some of his epistles. So Paul does not name. The titles for Paul's are added as well. Paul in his letters says who wrote them. But there are letters where Paul says he wrote them, and scholars don't think Paul wrote it. The reason scholars in general don't think that the authors were who church tradition says is not because of the title. The title may be a reason, but like I said, even if the titles were on there originally, many times scholars would still say that's probably not who the author was. I think you're strawmanning the old position. Alright, we'll keep going.
So it seems with Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, Judas, etc., where they would put the name of an authoritative figure early on in the Jesus ministry to give it more oomph. So basically, instead of saying like the Gospel of Bob, who no one knows Bob.
Okay, like the Gospel of Thomas, the title was added later. In the preface of the Gospel of Thomas says something along the lines of, Jesus told these things to me, the twin Thomas, or something like that. It's not in the title like you're saying.
At all. And so the Gospel of Thomas, who is tied to Jesus, it makes it deemed more reliable. Another argument would be, since the Gospels do not have a title like other New Testament writings, it shows we don't know who the original authors were. So before we get into it, it's important to note that...
Okay, so he's quoting a scholar who is saying that just because the consensus says something doesn't mean that's what's true. I agree with this. I don't think anyone's saying that whatever the consensus is, it's true because it's consensus. I will say, for people like Blessed and I, who are interested non-experts, we should probably start with the consensus, and as we get deeper and deeper into the scholarship, maybe we can diverge from it. But I don't necessarily disagree with this.
This is the majority view of most scholars, even Christian remain a matter of new perspective, would be including...
Okay, and then he quotes Gathercole. So he uses Gathercole for a good portion of his video. So here he's just saying that the fact that the Gospels don't name the author is a neglected topic in the New Testament studies. Gathercole here is a little perturbed that most scholars just take it for granted and go with what has been the prevailing thought for a while now, that the Gospels authors aren't named and are anonymous.
Important before we get into that the apparent anonymity of the Gospels is a neglected study in Germany is marked without understanding something of the authorship.
Okay, so this is the first actual point Blessed's making. So you present your video saying that the titles are not found on the original Gospels. And as I say later, or as I said before, that's not necessarily the reason why scholars think the authors aren't who they say they are. The reasons for thinking an author is who people attest it to be or things like that, those reasons have to be analyzed and thoroughly thought about, and there could be good or bad reasons for who that author could be. And if scholars think that the authors given to us were given to us for bad reasons, consensus may start to sway against that being the author. And that's what's happened with many of the New Testament authors. So obviously here you're acknowledging that titles were added later on, and then you say that Matthew and Luke wouldn't use Mark unless they knew something about Mark's authorship. So by the way, this probably should have been something you added on your other slide where you're talking about some of the reasons people don't believe authorship. This is one of the most famous arguments for Matthew not being the author of who he says he is. It is almost inconceivable that Matthew, who would have been an eyewitness, would copy stories about himself from Mark, who is not an eyewitness. If Matthew's copying these stories, many times word for word, that is a strong piece of evidence for lots of scholars that he himself was not an eyewitness. Luke is a little bit of a different story. Luke wasn't an eyewitness, so it's not that surprising that he would go to someone that is also not an eyewitness. And I would agree, though, that they probably believe this is a good source of information. It doesn't tell us that they think it's Mark. It doesn't say that for sure. Now, you don't say that in your slide right here, so I'm not saying you did say that, but I'm just emphasizing your point here isn't actually arguing for it being Mark's authorship. You're just saying that they thought it was from a trustworthy source. Which even that in itself doesn't mean a ton. People trust sources of information all the time, even if they're bad sources. But okay, let's move on.
From it belong to, that's where it's coming from. So we see this in Luke's preface, used an investigative tactic. Subject.
Okay. So we have the first point you're making that has a quotation. Let's pull up Baum's work since you are quoting Baum. Or I think I already have Baum's work up. We have Baum's work up. Blessed. Okay. So you are arguing here that Baum has this piece in 2008. It has a work, and you're saying that he argues in that work that it's mysterious how the Gospels don't have names added to them. And you cite, by the way, at the end, the alleged anonymity of the Gospels. Baum didn't write that. So you're saying Baum said this, and you quote something Baum didn't write. Gathercole writes the alleged anonymity of the Gospels. And on Gathercole's work, he writes about Baum. So you're kind of citing it improperly. Gathercole doesn't say that Baum thinks it's mysterious that the Gospels don't have title. Baum's whole paper is arguing the opposite of that. Let's look at the abstract of the paper that you're quoting from Baum. The anonymity of the New Testament historical books should not be regarded as peculiar. Should not be regarded. You say that he thinks it's peculiar or a mystery that they're anonymous. He doesn't say that. He says the opposite. Let's look at his conclusion to his paper. to his conclusion says, should be very similar to abstract. The anonymity of the New Testament historical books should not be regarded as peculiar to early Christian literature, nor should they be interpreted in the context of Greco-Roman historiography. His whole argument is they're not Greco-Roman history, and that it should not be peculiar. You say in your video that Baum is arguing the opposite of what he argues in that paper, and then you cite it as a different paper. Then you go on to say, on the same page Gathercole gives... Okay, let's go to Gathercole's paper real quick. Okay, you say, on the same page... Gathercole gives an observation. The absence of names is no accident, for the absence of titles was a common feature of the Near Eastern. Blessed! Gathercole. So before you say Baum says something, and it's not what Baum says, it's the opposite of what he says, and then you quote a different paper, and now you're saying Gathercole says something. Gathercole doesn't say this. He's quoting Baum again. Here he's talking that Baum, considering the Gospels and Acts to be a history book, and his title says it's history, and he pays attention to the fact that Greek historians would mention their name and province in the title and preface. Gathercole disagrees with this. Well, actually, he says, yeah, Greek historians would, but Roman historians are different. That's Gathercole's argument. And here he's quoting Baum again. As with the authors already considered, however, the absence of names is no accident, for the absence of titles was a common feature in the Near Eastern and especially Old Testament history writings. And that's Baum's arguments. We shouldn't be thinking about this as Greco-Roman history, because they always have the titles and stuff like that. That's what Baum argues. He's saying we should consider this like Old Testament Jewish writings, because the Jewish writings almost never have the authors. They quote Baum... Gathercole quotes Baum here saying that. You say Gathercole says it. Gathercole says that they're writing Roman biography. It's different than what Baum argues. Baum argues it is not Greek or Roman history. And says that the absence of the evangelist names should excite no comment at all. And most scholars argue something like this, I would say. And Swain says that it's perfectly normal for the literary work. What I would emphasize is, I think what you're trying to argue is scholars think because there's no title, the author isn't who it says they are. That's not why they say the author isn't who they say, who the church says it is. That's not the reason scholars give. I don't think there's a scholar out there who thinks the title is the most important part of determining who the author is. We'll keep going though.
The author themselves to be important. For example, Armin Baum in 2008 observation says the absence of names is no that was important feature.
Okay. You say that Gathercole gives an impressive list of writings which do not include the names of the author in the title nor the preface. So Gathercole's very specific about this part. He specifically, it's in the title or preface, which Blessed notes here. I'm only saying that because Gathercole admits in his paper that sometimes it'll say it otherwise. Let's go through just a couple of these just to fact check them. And I just want to emphasize that although it's true, Gathercole's being very picky with his words here, and he does admit also that in the preface it typically and almost always indicates who the author is. So Zenon has a work. Now he has lots of different works, and he puts his title, he quotes himself as the author in almost all of them. Blessed doesn't quote which one he's talking about, but it's Anabasis, because that's the one that Gathercole uses. And Anabasis, Xenophon does say who the author is, but he uses a pseudonym. He says it's Themistosthenes from Syracuse. So an author is given, but scholars will generally agree that it's talking about Xenophon. and it just doesn't have Xenophon's name. It has a pseudonym. Okay, is this anonymous? I don't know if you can call that anonymous, but that's one of the ones used. Josephus's Antiquities. Okay, I have this pulled up. Okay, so this is the preface to the Antiquities. Let me pull it up, actually. Okay, so Josephus has multiple different works. He names himself in his other works. In the Jewish War, he says that I, Josephus, son of this person, wrote the Jewish War. In the Antiquities, he has in his preface says that he's a Jew who was in the Jewish-Roman War, who's now writing in Greek, who wrote about the Jewish-Roman War, says that his Jewish-Roman War work was supposed to be part of this work, the Antiquities, but all the translating was very difficult for him because it's a foreign tongue for him. We have tons of information letting us know who the author was. And we have lots of outside people attesting that it's the author, that Josephus is the author as well. And we have other works from Josephus, so we can compare their writing styles. There's a lot of very sophisticated techniques they use to, if you have multiple works from the same author, or allegedly the same author, they can compare. There's some ways people use stuff that is not a conscious part of writing, and that they typically do the same no matter what they're writing. And they compare those things, and they can tell. Anonymous? I don't know if you can call that anonymous, but that's one of the ones used. Josephus's Antiquities. Okay, I have this pulled up. Okay, so this is the preface to the Antiquities. Let me pull it up, actually. Okay, so Josephus has multiple different works. He names himself in his other works. In the Jewish War, he says that I, Josephus, son of this person, wrote the Jewish War. In the Antiquities, he has in his preface says that he's a Jew who was in the Jewish-Roman War, who's now writing in Greek, who wrote about the Jewish-Roman War, says that his Jewish-Roman War work was supposed to be part of this work, the Antiquities, but all the translating was very difficult for him because it's a foreign tongue for him. We have tons of information letting us know who the author was. And we have lots of outside people attesting that it's the author, that Josephus is the author as well. And we have other works from Josephus, so we can compare their writing styles. There's a lot of very sophisticated techniques they use to, if you have multiple works from the same author, or allegedly the same author, they can compare. There's some ways people use stuff that is not a conscious part of writing, and that they typically do the same no matter what they're writing. And they compare those things, and they can tell, yeah, this is pretty much the same author. There are lots of different ways to tell. The third one, I'll probably stop here. Diodorus Siculus, the Library of History. So, and this is where I was saying Gathercole's being very specific when he's saying title or preface. Diodorus, the Library of Histories is like 20 volumes on the history of the world, or from his time. And he does not name himself in the title or preface, but where does he name himself? All throughout all of those volumes. All throughout all of the volumes. So it's not as though we don't know who the author is. Okay, I don't have the energy to go through every single one of them, and I'm sure that some of these, and maybe even many of them, the authorship is questionable, or it might not even say who the author is at all. I'm sure that happens sometimes. We have other ways of determining it, clearly because we think we know who the authors are. Sometimes it's the context being in line with the author's context. So if everybody at who copies that paper says it's from this person, and there's some context in there that seems to indicate it's not from that person. If an ancient author talks about Wi-Fi, it probably wasn't the ancient author that wrote that. If there's some reason to attribute authorship to someone that it might not have been, such as bias or something like that, many ancient writers attribute their work to famous philosophers as a way to make their work circulate more or seem more authoritative. We have Greek and Roman writers writing about forgeries in their own names that they themselves did not write, but they see it existing. If we have multiple other writings from the same writer, we can also compare the writings and see if there's maybe reason to doubt the attested authorship. There's lots of different reasons other than just this anonymous thing. You also named the you had Lacona talks about the Julius Caesar commentaries here. There's a lot of debate whether he wrote them or not. I think consensus is probably that he did, but I hear debate about that all the time. This is sort of the same thing with Shakespeare. Caesar doesn't have his name on, or at least not originally, on the title of his works or in the preface or anywhere throughout his commentaries. And people debate whether it was him or not, only because the only indication we have in this case is outside attestation, and there's some arguments for the context not fitting what Caesar was talking about. The same thing happens with Shakespeare. Shakespeare has his name on the title and throughout the preface, and everybody says it was Shakespeare. There's nobody in history that says Caesar's work was not from Caesar, and nobody in history that says Shakespeare's work was not Shakespeare. Yet scholars today question both. It's not the title or preface that makes scholars determine who the author is. It's other information. Alright, we'll keep going on your video.
Simon Gathercole, who's a professor at Cambridge University on New Testament Studies and Antiquities, he refers life with the theories of the civil was automatically Plutarch's authorship.
So I found where Lacona is talking here. Blessed, you're scaring me. I really feel like you need to read some of these closer. I don't think you're messing up the citations, and you're messing up what these people are saying. You argue that Lacona is saying Plutarch, who's one of the most famous ancient authors, this is true, and you say that his best work is the Lamprias Catalog. This is just not true. His best work is the Parallel Lives. The Lamprias Catalog was not even written by Plutarch. How are you saying it's his best work? Where are you getting that? I'd be curious where you're getting that. Lacona doesn't say it. I found where I think you misread it, probably. The best source for attesting Plutarch's authorship is the Lamprias Catalog, written more than a century, perhaps two, after Plutarch's death. Additionally, it is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. Still, no one questions Plutarch's authorship. The Lamprias Catalog is a list of things Plutarch wrote a century or two after Plutarch lived, which you note, so I don't know why you're saying people think it was Plutarch. How was it Plutarch? It was written a century or two after him. That list was falsely attributed to Plutarch's son, and so nobody thinks that. They don't know who wrote it. It's anonymous. It's not anonymous. We don't know who the author is. It's pseudonymous. It says it's an author that it's not. Nobody's saying Plutarch wrote this. What Lacona's arguing here is a century or two later, we have something saying these are the things Plutarch wrote, and Plutarch wrote them. So this is saying Plutarch was the author of the lives, are mainly what we'd refer to, the parallel lives. And he's comparing this with the Gospels and Irenaeus. The Lamprias Catalog is to Irenaeus, and Plutarch's writing is to the Gospels. He's not saying they wrote each other. It's a source saying he wrote it. Um, let me pull up another book by um, all right, let me pull up another book by Lacona, and he talks about the Lampreys catalog in here. And so this is what Lacona says in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? The Lampreys catalog is alleged to have been written by Plutarch's grandson, or son, some people say son. However, its date of composition rules out such a possibility, therefore it's synonymous. He's not saying Plutarch wrote it. I don't know where you get this. When he is talking about Plutarch, he says that Plutarch died somewhere around 120 or later. The Lampreys catalog was possibly 3rd or 4th century. People usually date it 275 to 325. So that's going to be 150-ish years after Plutarch was alive. Around the same time as Irenaeus to the Gospels, by the way. But anyways, the Lampreys catalog lists items written by Plutarch. He's not saying Plutarch wrote it. So, I mean, it scares me a little bit that you're getting a lot of this info wrong, Blessed. Okay, let's keep going though. You then use this thing to say that the authorship of Plutarch is much worse than the Gospels, yet people question the Gospels' authorship. This is once again a straw man. So let's pretend you got this information right about the Lampreys catalog. The fact that the Lampreys catalog was written 150 years after Plutarch, and the attestation that you're talking about was a little over 100 years from most of the Gospels, just under 100 for John. That's not the reason scholars give for saying we don't know the author. Blessed, that's not the reason they give. This is a straw man. The fact that by the way, 50 years would not make a difference if a lot of weight was being given to that time frame. By the way, that's not why scholars think that. I don't know why you keep saying that.
There's little to no doubt about his authorship, and that they're also on par on, as in history, the case for Jesus, which I recommend anyone to get.
Evans notes there are no anonymous copies of the Gospels, and there are no copies of the canonical Gospels under a different name. And if evidence of the contrary should surface, we should stop talking about anonymous Gospels, late unhistorical superscriptions and subscriptions. And so this is funny. You keep quoting Gathercole to give evidence that the Gospels aren't anonymous. Why does Gathercole say that we should not be calling them anonymous? His whole argument is just because the title wasn't originally there, or it's not in the preface, it should not be called anonymous, because what if it was in a subscription or superscription? That's Gathercole's whole point, and he even calls it an argument from silence and acknowledges that what he's saying we don't really have evidence of, but there's potential, or it's plausible to assume that could have been the case. You then quote someone who's talking bad about that thought. And I agree, it's sort of a weak argument to say they could have had the author's name in a superscription or subscription, but that's Gathercole's argument. You then say that we have no anonymous copies from Papyrus 4 to the Codex. So I agree with this in principle. We have lots of copies that don't have titles, but it's because most of our early copies are partials, and the actual heading area is almost always destroyed. The outsides of the manuscripts get destroyed first. Papyrus 4, which you mentioned, is our earliest manuscript with a title. Papyrus 4, let's see. Papyrus 4 contains partial pieces of the Gospel of Luke from Luke 1:58 to Luke 6:16. And one of those partial pieces has a title on it. What is the title, though? The title is the Gospel of Matthew. Papyrus 4 only contains Luke, and the title on it is Matthew. Now, because it's just a partial piece that says Matthew, you could argue it's not, it wasn't saying that they thought Matthew was Luke. But someone could argue that. I just think it's funny that the one thing you give has a different title than the content of the information in that manuscript. All right, I'll keep going.
No reason has ever been.
Okay, so you talk about how Lake says that. So there are some scholars who try to argue that Mark may have had the title originally on his gospel. You talk about how Dunn says that John and Matthew deserves respect. The authorship of those books deserves respect. It's hard to know exactly what they meant by that. Okay, you have this line here. Blomberg, Keener, and the skeptical Elaine Pagels also agrees there's significant testimony in John to indicate authorship. Blessed, you're better than this. You're better than this. I know you are. I'm guessing you're including Elaine Pagels to emphasize the fact that she's a skeptic because you want it to appear that this is a more widely held belief than it really is. I don't think you want it to appear like only the most conservative sides of scholarship would argue this. Elaine Pagel, the book you quote isn't even about this. She devotes no sections or chapters to her book about the authorship. It's about the Gospel of Thomas. The few things she says, none of which indicate that she thought John could be the author. The closest she gets is saying that it could have been somebody in Jesus' circle. When she's giving a just brief overview of the Gospel of John, as she's comparing it to the Gospel of Thomas, she talks about that it was written from 90 to 130 CE, that the early Christians disagreed whether it was a true gospel or not. Those who defended it said it was irrational. Those who defended it said that those who didn't think it was original called them irrational. The people who did not think it was authoritative point out how different it is from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and she goes on to name several times where John's gospel directly contradicts the combined testimony of the other gospels. This may be the part where you're getting that Elaine Pagel thinks that it was John the Apostle. So by the way, she argues against this several times, as I will show. So the author was a Jewish follower who probably lived in Ephesus, the capital of Syria, towards the end of the 1st century. And by the way, note that the Gospel of John, she says, could have been written all the way up to 130. Yet this person could have been dead at 100. So some scholars, not her, say that he could have been a group attached with John the Baptist that kind of met Jesus that way, or heard of Jesus that way. And some people think that this is a John, an other John, that may have followed Jesus. Says that there's some indications that he knew the area, knew local Jewish practices, and that there's some details which might suggest that he traveled with Jesus during their last journey to Jerusalem. She's still saying it's a different John. Not just than John the Baptist, a different John from John the Apostle. Even when she's talking about if this John, because there's some arguments that it's John the Elder, is why she's saying that. But from the 2nd century to the present, most Christians have assumed that the author of the gospel was in fact the John who was the brother of James, whom saw mending nets with their father Zebedee and called himself one of those who immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. In that case, John would be in one of the group called the 12, headed by Peter. Yet, and here she is contradicting that message, the gospel itself, possibly the added conclusion, declares it was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. If John, the son of Zebedee, why was that beloved disciple? Why does his name never appear in the gospel? She argues quite a bit that even if this was a follower of Jesus, and she I think she does think it could have been someone who knew Jesus, the original testimony from it, not who actually authored it. But it was not someone in the 12. Two generations of scholars have devoted hundreds of articles and monographs to such questions and have proposed various solutions. Such suggests that the author was a different John, John the Elder, a follower of Jesus from Ephesus, whom Christians in later generations confused with John the Apostle. Others say that the disciple John, and that's the strength of that argument, by the way, is there's a quote from Papias, who seems to indicate that someone named John the Elder might have wrote something. And the thought is, oh, if John the Elder wrote it, that could be a good reason why people thought John the Apostle did, because they confused it later. Others say that the disciple John was a witness whose authority stood behind the gospel, was not the actual author. So when even quoting other people, one of the ideas is that he was the witness who the author's writing about, but still not the author. Still others believe the author was an anonymous leader of a lesser-known circle of the disciples, distinct from the 12. And this seems to be, based on the other things that she says, what she leans towards. She says, the gospel we call John's name insists on the contrary, that no one, not even Peter, knew Jesus as well as the disciple whom Jesus loved. This mysterious, unnamed disciple who is actually assumed to be John himself. So she argues that although John gives some sort of leadership to Peter, that John seems to, or the author seems to argue that the disciple whom Jesus loved was actually a more important leader than Peter. Although the author of this gospel may not have been one of the 12, he does acknowledge Peter's leadership, but with qualifications. John's final chapter, perhaps added later, tells of how Jesus himself ordered Peter to care for his flock. Like I said, this is sort of the thing talking about how he acknowledges some of Peter's leadership, but not entirely. My problem with this is that's all Pagel says about the authorship of John in her book. She doesn't even devote time to it to argue for or against. She just says what some scholars think and seems to indicate throughout it that, I mean, she refers to it a lot as the author of John, separating it from John, but nothing in there does she say that it deserves that there's any evidence that John was the author. Now, the two other people that you named, like I said, the way you structure this, Blomberg, Keener, and the skeptical Pagel, it feels like you're trying to make it sound like there's a semi-wide range of people who believe this. Blomberg and Keener are as conservative, essentially, as you can get on authorship. Let's find... Okay, so not only does Ellen Pagel only really ever argue the opposite of what you're saying, Blomberg and Keener, the way you presented it makes it sound like you want it to be a wide range of scholarship. Keener, in his works, argues entirely to defend the most conservative side of scholarship. Blomberg, in his works, devotes his book to defending the most conservative side of scholarships and fighting against the idea that that extreme conservative side of scholarship aren't doing a good job. These are some of the things that Blomberg and Keener say in their works. Just to, I think, to be fair, since you were trying to make it sound like there's a wide range of scholarship ideas on John being the actual author of John, these are the things that Blomberg and Keener say. This is something that Keener writes. The authorship of the fourth gospel has been vigorously debated. Although traditional consensus from the early church centuries that the Apostle John wrote it has now given way to the majority scholarly skepticism towards the claim. But this consensus has been challenged recently by some conservative commentators, most notably Morris Carson and Blomberg. And, obviously Keener agrees with this, it has been challenged with good reason. Even Keener is acknowledging here that the people who challenge it are the conservative commentators. Keener argues in his book, I mean, this is to show how conservative he is. He argues in his book that Revelation and John probably come from the same author. He tries to argue that it's plausible that they had the same authorship. Have you ever heard an actual scholar defend that? This is how conservative his views are. He even acknowledges in his same book that many scholars believe that the Gospel and epistles, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, were written by different authors, and the vast majority of scholars believe that the Gospel and Revelations were written by different authors. Now, almost nobody believes these things that these people you're citing believe. Blomberg cites in his work, why then is Johannine authorship almost universally rejected among more critical scholarship? Now, he is trying to argue that John is the author, as with Keener, but he at least acknowledges, and I kind of wish you would in your paper, that almost nobody else believes this. He also says in that same book, today, for a variety of reasons, not all of equal weight, all but the most conservative of scholars no longer believe that John the Apostle was the author of the fourth Gospel. Obviously, almost nobody, and Blomberg, in his book, trying to defend it, also notes that nobody but the most conservative believes what you're citing here. And I want to point something else out as well. You'll see here that he has Blomberg and Keener, and then the skeptic Elaine Pagels. Now, Elaine Pagels doesn't believe what he's saying she believes. Blomberg and Keener, though, I think I found exactly where Blessed got his source. You'll see here that he has Blomberg first, page 22 through 41, and then he has Keener, pages 81 through 115. In Mike Lacona's book, Why Are the Differences in the Gospels, he argues in his citation that Blomberg and Keener both favor traditional authorship, and quotes Blomberg, pages 21 through 41, the same exact pages, and then Keener, 81 through 139, so slightly different pages, starts at the same page. You'll see this little 1 at the beginning. This denotes usually a volume, or if it's part of a journal, it might be the first issue of that journal. What is Blessed? He says page 1, semicolon 81. Now, that might have been an accident, but I think this is good indication. He literally is copying these quotes from the citations of other people. This makes a lot of sense. This is probably how he's misreading a lot of these quotations. Now we've got this summary. On your summary page, you say that skeptics in public circles just repeat the same old thing. I mean, I would argue that in the public circles, pretty much everybody repeats the same old thing, but I'm not going to defend what's going on in public circles. You say you've gone over the... By the way, you didn't summarize. That's not a summary position. It's not something that you made an argument for. You just added on at the end of the summary, but it's not something you argued in your video here. But we have gone over the new perspective of authorship, comparing them to ancient writings. This was a common feature found. Thus weren't no curious feature, as Gathercole says, regarding titles not being found in the original writings. Yes. Now, Gathercole's argument, like I said, isn't just... Gathercole doesn't even think it should be called anonymous, even if it has no title and preface. His argument is we can't call it anonymous because it could have had in the original writing a superscript or subscript, and later when that got taken away, they put a title on instead. That's Gathercole's argument. It's a weak argument, but that is his argument. And like I said, he calls it an argument from silence in his work that you're quoting from. The authorship attestation is superior in time from that of Plutarch's writing, where there's little to no doubt on his authorship. You just totally misread the point of this. You think Plutarch wrote the Lamprias catalog. I mean, you totally, just annihilate the whole purpose of that point Lacona's making. And scholars don't say that's why they don't think these people were the authors of the writings. You then say that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were known in different areas, thus coming back to an early source saying the same thing. I agree with this, but that early source is in the late 2nd century. In that 150 to 180 time frame, from there, that is what gets spread out. Then you say there are no anonymous copies of our manuscripts of the gospel. None that we can confirm are anonymous. Like I said, most of the early partials are ruined, so we can't see it. The same as other ancient writings outside of Christianity. There are no anonymous copies of other ancient writings outside of Christianity. That is not true. Maybe that was a typo. Most of your video here is devoted to saying that writings outside of Christianity were anonymous. So how can you be saying there was no anonymous writings? But is this all? Okay. There are no competing this isn't a summary. This is the first time you've said anything like this. This isn't a summary, Blessed. The fact that people in ancient days don't make an argument that we're making now is not surprising at all. Like I said, with Caesar and Shakespeare, we have no competing traditions, and yet people do doubt their authorship. This is not one of the reasons why scholars doubt it, and this is an argument from silence again. You seem to be a fan of those from Gathical and from this summary page of something you've never talked about in the previous part of the video. If you'd want to take down a fast-growing movement, why not just say it's anonymous? You're making a good point. They could have just made it up and said it, right? Yeah, I mean, it would be just as good evidence if they made it up and said it. If there was some random writing saying that these Christians are just making up authors, scholars would try to analyze that and say, it's coming from kind of a biased perspective. It's kind of hard to know. This is an anti-Christian individual. This is the same reason when you have Orthodox Christianity talking about the Gnostic Gospels, scholars take it with a grain of salt because this is people who are against the Gnostic Gospels talking about it. Right? It'd be the same thing. I mean, if bias is involved, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And then you ask if any of these people would like to see you do some other arguments. Alright, so I think this is the entirety of the video.